Imagine being God's chosen one, the man with enough strength to destroy any enemy, but with a weakness so great it could destroy him. Samson, the most feared warrior of Israel. He possessed a strength that defied human limits. He was chosen to be a hero, but his story is unlike any other. He rose to the top, but what no one knew was that his greatest enemy did not come from the outside, but from within. He had everything to be unbeatable, yet a betrayal led to his unexpected downfall. A woman. A promise. A broken trust. And the destruction of an empire. What happened to Samson? How could such a powerful man be defeated? How could someone who had the power to crush armies be reduced to nothing? This is not just the story of a man and his strength. It is the story of a warrior who, even when everything seemed lost, found a greater strength within himself. A strength capable of bringing down even the mightiest empires. Get ready for a journey of redemption and vengeance. This story will change everything you think about power and weakness. Samson's story begins long before he was born. His mother, who had never been able to have children, lived in sorrow and despair. She longed to be a mother, but for some reason, she could not conceive. In a time of great anguish, while she was at home, something extraordinary happened. The sky, which had seemed distant and silent, opened. A divine presence miraculously entered her life. It was the angel of the Lord. The angel appeared before her and, in a serene yet powerful manner, announced something that would change her life forever. He told her that, despite being barren, she would have a son. But this would not be just any child. This baby would be chosen by God, with a great divine purpose. He would not be born like any other child. The angel explained that the baby was to be a Nazirite, someone consecrated to God from the moment of conception. Imagine the surprise and joy of this woman, who had long dreamed of becoming a mother. But at the same time, she felt the weight of responsibility. The angel gave specific instructions regarding Samson's birth. She was not to drink wine or eat anything unclean during her pregnancy. And most importantly, when the baby was born, he was to be dedicated to the Lord for his entire life. Samson's hair was never to be cut, and he was to live as someone set apart for God, avoiding the ways of the world. You will have a son, and he will be strong and powerful. He will be a man of God, said the angel. Samson would possess extraordinary strength, something no one could have imagined at that moment. He would not be just any child, he would be a key instrument in God's hands to bring deliverance to the people of Israel, who were under the oppression of the Philistines. This miracle was not just a blessing for his mother but a promise of change for an entire nation. Israel was going through a difficult time, full of struggles and hardships. The people were being oppressed by the Philistines, and many had already lost hope. But with Samson's birth, something was about to happen. The miracle that was coming was not just the birth of a boy but the arrival of a hero, born from the very heart of God. After receiving this message, the woman was the first to hear God's promise. And with faith, she embraced it with a heart full of hope. This miracle, this child, was not just the fulfillment of a mother's desire. It was the beginning of a journey that would forever change the destiny of the people of Israel. Imagining what was going through that woman's mind, we can understand that, in the face of such a great miracle, she probably felt small before the grandeur of God's plan. Yet, she knew the promise would be fulfilled. She treasured every word spoken by the angel in her heart and, with faith, awaited the birth of the one who would change history. Before we continue, take a quick moment to check if you're subscribed to the channel so you won't miss any of the upcoming episodes of this incredible journey through Samson's life and the stories of many other heroes of the Bible. Samson was a man like no other. From the time he was young, something mysterious and powerful was present in his life, something that set him apart from everyone around him. The Spirit of God came upon him in a unique way, granting him a strength that seemed to defy all natural laws. One day, as he walked through the hills, he suddenly came face to face with a ferocious lion, a wild beast whose roars echoed through the forest. The lion, hungry and filled with rage, charged toward Samson, its sharp claws and teeth ready to strike. The scene seemed inevitable. The lion, with its superior strength and agility, would likely overpower what appeared to be an ordinary man. But something extraordinary happened. At that crucial moment, the Spirit of God took hold of Samson. He felt no fear, nor did he hesitate. Something beyond human comprehension surged through his body. Samson grabbed the lion with his bare hands, as if handling a mere lamb, and tore it apart effortlessly. The beast, which many believed could destroy any man, now lay defeated by Samson's simple touch. And he used no sword, no spear, his strength came from God, not from human weapons. Imagine this for a moment. He was not a hero like those in tales of knights or legendary warriors wielding enchanted swords. Samson didn't need that. He possessed something far greater, a supernatural power that enabled him to accomplish feats impossible to the eyes of any man. He didn't rely on ordinary tools, his strength was divine, coming directly from God, and that made him unstoppable. This victory over the lion was not just a display of physical strength. It was a sign that Samson was chosen by God for a special mission. A mission beyond any human battle, a grand purpose that was about to unfold. This feat, the first of many, set the tone for Samson's life. He would become an unbeatable figure, a man driven by the power of God. And as time passed, more supernatural and astonishing deeds would follow. But this first encounter, with the lion, was only the beginning of Samson's journey, a moment that revealed to the world the incomparable power of a man anointed by the Spirit of God. Samson's story begins to take a dangerous and intriguing turn the moment he makes a choice that goes against everything he was meant to represent. It was a decision driven by his own desires, but also by impulse and a lack of reflection. Samson, the man blessed by God with supernatural strength, a chosen leader to deliver the people of Israel from the Philistines, decides to marry a Philistine woman. Now, imagine this for a moment. Samson grew up in a culture where the Israelites were God's chosen people, set apart to fulfill a divine purpose. His parents, Manoah and his wife, had been visited by an angel who gave them specific instructions on how to raise Samson, a man consecrated to God from birth, destined to be a Nazirite, someone who was supposed to live in holiness and total dedication to the Lord. His parents, knowing all of this, expected Samson to follow God's ways and remain faithful to his mission. But Samson had his own ideas. He saw a Philistine woman in the city of Timnah, and despite knowing that the Philistines were the oppressors of his people, he was drawn to her. The woman's beauty and the desire he felt for her outweighed any advice or wisdom he might receive. Overcome by this passion, Samson went to his parents and announced his decision, "I want to marry that woman from Timnah." His parents, shocked and concerned, tried to dissuade him. They knew the Philistines were enemies of Israel, and marrying one of them would be a great risk. But Samson insisted, saying she was the woman he wanted and that he had no other choice. His parents, unable to change his mind, reluctantly gave in. At this moment, what seemed like just a personal choice, a decision to follow his own feelings and desires, began to reveal the great conflict within Samson's heart. He was drifting away from divine guidance, surrendering to momentary desires without considering the consequences. He was not only disobeying his parents, he was disobeying God, who had called him to a much greater mission. His marriage to the Philistine woman was the beginning of a series of conflicts, not only with the Philistines but also with his own identity. Samson, a leader chosen by God, began living a life of contradictions. He was a powerful and chosen man, but his human weaknesses were becoming more and more evident. He was on a path of self-destruction, ignoring the greater purpose God had for his life and giving in to his passions instead of listening to God's voice. By marrying the Philistine woman, Samson also began to reveal another side of his personality. He was not just a warrior but a man with emotions, and when those emotions were misdirected, they began to cloud his judgment and affect his decisions. The marriage itself not only caused a great conflict with the Philistines but also brought to light the internal struggle Samson faced. His strength and divine calling were in constant conflict with his personal choices and human flaws. This marriage, which might have seemed simple, was actually a turning point in Samson's life. It marked the beginning of a path that would lead him into a series of confrontations and tragedies. What seemed like just a love story or a forbidden desire was, in reality, the start of a process that would shake his entire journey, both with the people of Israel and with God. After the scandal that destroyed his marriage, Samson felt a deep pain. The betrayal of his wife, who had revealed the secret of his riddle to the Philistines, left him furious. And so, he left the wedding feast, abandoning the Philistine woman and heading home with a heavy heart, his mind filled with anger and sorrow. The betrayal and humiliation he endured echoed in his soul, but it also pushed him forward, with an ever-growing desire to take justice into his own hands. Over time, Samson, as if drawn by the pain of solitude and the need for answers, decided to return. But when he went back to his parents' house, he found what he least expected. The woman he had married was given to another man. The betrayal was no longer just from his wife, but from the Philistines themselves, who saw Samson as a threat and wanted to remove him from their path. Seeing that his wife was no longer available, Samson was devastated, but his anger overwhelmed him. He knew he needed to take action, to respond to the affront. But his response would be so impactful that, even to him, it seemed almost beyond imagination. In an act of fierce and merciless revenge, Samson, with a fury that seemed to come from the depths of his soul, made a radical decision. He went into the fields and, with his superhuman strength, captured 300 foxes. He didn't just catch the animals, but he prepared them in a terrifying way. Samson tied the foxes in pairs, connecting them by their tails, and to each of these tails, he tied a lit torch. And so, with his pairs of foxes, Samson released them into the fields of the Philistines. As the foxes ran, the torches spread, and the Philistines' crops were consumed by the flames. The fire destroyed their fields, vineyards, and harvests, everything the Philistines had cultivated with so much effort. This act of revenge was not only a response to a personal offense, but a clear sign that Samson was willing to go to any lengths to avenge those who had betrayed and humiliated him. He had crossed all boundaries. And as the flames spread, the conflict between Samson and the Philistines intensified even more. The destruction of their crops was a painful blow to them, a public humiliation that could not be ignored. The consequences of this act of anger and revenge were immense, and it set Samson on a path of destruction and confrontation that would only grow. Samson's actions left the Philistines furious. They searched for him, filled with rage and a desire for revenge. But Samson didn't care about what would happen next. He had already crossed the line. He wanted everyone to know that he would not be submissive, that he would not bow down before the enemies of Israel. He wanted his strength and courage to be felt, so brutally and tangibly that no one would dare challenge him again. And so, Samson's return to his parents' house and the destruction of the Philistines' fields marked the beginning of a series of confrontations and battles that would only escalate in intensity. Once again, God's warrior was on the front lines, not just fighting for his honor, but for the people of Israel. The revenge was complete, but what would come next, no one could predict. At this moment in Samson's story, he not only lost his marriage and his wife, but gained something even more important, the certainty that his struggle would not be easy, but that he was willing to pay any price to see justice done. And with each step, he drew closer to his great mission, more deeply immersed in his role as the one chosen to bring liberation to the people of Israel. It was a quiet night, and the gentle wind whispered through the curtains of the tent where Samson lay resting. He was tired, after so many conflicts and battles, unaware of what awaited him. The strength God had given him made him feel invincible, unbeatable. But, as in many tales of downfall, it was precisely when he felt strongest that he came closest to his greatest vulnerability. Delilah, with her sweet smile and seductive eyes, was beside him. She knew his strengths, and more than that, she knew the secret he had kept. Samson's power was in his hair, something he had revealed in a moment of weakness, thinking that in his trust, Delilah would never use this information against him. But she was no longer just an ordinary woman. She was determined to destroy the man who destroyed the Philistines, and with that, her heart had become cold and calculating. Delilah watched Samson, deeply asleep, unaware that this would be the last peaceful rest of his life. With gentle and careful hands, she took a sharp pair of scissors. Each cut of his long hair felt like a blade cutting not only through his locks but through the very essence of his strength. And in that moment, something within Samson began to change. Without his hair, without God's power over him, the connection to his strength was severed. He didn't know this. The feeling wasn't immediate, but the danger was already in the air, and he couldn't feel it. Delilah didn't hesitate. When she finished, she called the Philistines, and the darkness surrounding Samson approached quickly. When he woke, he felt nothing but a strange emptiness in his body. He stood up, ready for another battle, for another glorious victory. But something was wrong. As he tried to fight the Philistines, Samson quickly realized that his strength had dissipated. He was completely vulnerable. He tried to move, tried to raise his arms as he had always done, but there was no power, no strength. At the most crucial moment of his life, he realized with horror that God had withdrawn his strength because of his misplaced trust, because he had revealed his secret. And without that, Samson was just an ordinary man. The Philistines, ready and prepared, wasted no time. They easily overcame him, immobilized him, and, brutally, blinded him. The pain was unbearable, but what hurt the most was knowing that his life would never be the same. Samson, the man who had been used by God to defeat powerful enemies, now lay on the ground, blind and humiliated. His pride and trust had been his downfall, and he was treated like an ordinary prisoner. He, who had defeated thousands, now found himself captured, chained, and completely powerless. But in that moment of darkness, while the Philistines dragged him to prison, a new reflection began to emerge in Samson's mind. He had lost everything he had gained, but there was still something he could recover: his humility, his repentance, and his reconnection with God. Samson didn't know it yet, but the end of his journey was about to become the beginning of a new chance, a chance to redeem himself, to return to the divine purpose, and to strike a blow that would make the heavens tremble. The cold floor of the Philistine prison was now the only place where Samson could rest his pain. His body was covered in wounds and scars, a reflection of the harsh chains binding his wrists and ankles. But what hurt the most were not the chains. It wasn't the whip of the jailers or the mocking laughter of his enemies. What hurt the most was the silence. The darkness was absolute. The The Philistines had torn out his eyes, leaving him in a world where the only thing left were his memories. And what bitter memories they were. He saw himself small again, in his mother's arms, hearing about the purpose God had for his life. He remembered the day he first felt the divine power running through his veins, when he killed a lion with his bare hands. And now? Now he was just an ordinary man, humiliated, defeated, reduced to a servant grinding grain like an animal. Samson sighed. He felt each beat of his heart like a hammer of regret. He had been chosen to deliver Israel, but he had allowed his pride and passion to lead him astray. Delilah's betrayal was just a reflection of his own choices. He had let himself be carried away by his own strength, trusting more in himself than in God. But, was this the end? He began to murmur prayers. At first, they were whispers, almost inaudible, heavy words of repentance. Lord, I have failed. Forgive me. With each day, his voice grew firmer. He knew he could not change the past, but he trusted that God still heard him. And then, something unexpected began to happen. His hair, which had been a symbol of his covenant with God, started to grow again. He felt the thick strands falling over his neck, and with that, a spark reignited within him. God was still there. His body was weak, but his faith was stronger than ever. Samson realized that his story was not over. He had not been called to live and die as a slave to the Philistines. There was still one last battle to fight, and this time, he would not fight with pride, but with a heart completely surrendered to the Lord. Little did he know, the moment of his greatest deed was closer than he imagined. Samson was blind. His hands, which once held the weapons of victory, now groped the emptiness, searching for any hope. The man who had once been the terror of the Philistines was now just a chained prisoner, humiliated, mocked. Dragged to the temple of the god Dagon, he heard the laughter, the insults, the mocking shouts echoing between the giant columns. The Philistines were euphoric. They had finally defeated Samson, the man who had terrorized their people for years. For them, it was more than a military victory. It was the complete humiliation of the God of Israel. The temple was packed. Nobles, warriors, and priests celebrated the triumph of Dagon over the god of Samson. Among the guests were the same leaders who had once trembled at the sound of his name, now treating him as a war trophy. Samson, guided by a young servant, was placed between the central columns of the temple. His body was weakened, his soul crushed. But in his heart, a flame still burned. He lifted his face, now void of sight, but full of faith. With a hoarse voice, broken by suffering, he whispered, "Sovereign Lord, remember me. Give me strength once more, just one more time. So that I may avenge myself on these Philistines for all they have done to me." The request was not just for vengeance. Samson knew he would not leave alive. But he wanted to fulfill the purpose for which he was born. He wanted to honor the God of Israel. Then, a shiver ran through his body. A warmth began to inflame his muscles, and a strength he thought he had lost forever began to pulse in his veins. He felt the presence of God. Samson planted his feet firmly on the stone floor. He took a deep breath. His hands slid along the columns until they found a firm grip. The noise of the crowd blended with the sound of his own heart beating faster. "It's now," he murmured. And then, with a cry that made the temple tremble, Samson pushed the columns with all the strength God had granted him. For a moment, time seemed to stop. The laughter of the Philistines died in the air. The columns, enormous and imposing, began to creak. Small cracks formed, running like spider webs across the stone. The entire structure groaned as if it were a living creature about to collapse. Then, everything crumbled. The ceiling gave way. The walls collapsed. The ground trembled. Shouts of terror replaced the mocking ones. Nobles and warriors tried to run, but there was nowhere to flee. In a matter of seconds, the temple of Dagon turned into a tomb for thousands of Philistines. And there, beneath the rubble, lay Samson. The man who had been chosen by God from his mother's womb. The warrior who fell because of his own weakness but, in the end, found redemption in his faith. On that day, he killed more enemies in his death than in all his life. Samson was gone, but his legacy would never be forgotten. His last act proved that even in moments of the greatest fall, God can still lift us up. He can still use us. For Samson's strength was never in his muscles. It was always in God. The crowd was cheering. The great temple of Dagon was packed. Mocking laughter echoed between the imposing columns. Philistine princes, soldiers, and citizens celebrated their supposed victory over the man who, once, was the terror of their lands. They had captured Samson, blinded his eyes, and turned him into a mere spectacle for their amusement. To them, that man was nothing more than a living trophy, a symbol of the humiliation of Israel. But what they didn't know was that Samson was not defeated. Not completely. He felt the chains on his wrists, the weight of his shame, and the absence of the sight he had lost. But within him, something reignited, a flame that never went out completely. Samson, with his hands feeling the central columns of the temple, raised his face to the sky, invisible to his eyes, but visible to his faith. Lord, God of hosts, remember me. Give me strength one more time, so that I may avenge my eyes against the Philistines. The prayer left his lips, heavy with regret, pain, and a deep desire to fulfill the purpose God had given him since his mother's womb. He knew there was no tomorrow for him. He would not go home. He would never see the light of day again. But if God was with him in that moment, then his death would not be in vain. Samson tightened his hands on the columns, feeling the cold dust of the stone against his calloused fingers. He breathed deeply. His muscles, once weakened, began to fill with a strength he recognized well. It was God. The same God who, from the beginning, had set him apart for a mission. And now, here, even after his mistakes, the Lord was giving him one last chance. The laughter around him grew louder. Someone shoved him from behind, mocking him as if he were just a circus animal. But then, suddenly, the sound changed. A creaking echoed throughout the temple. First, a slight crack, as if the stones were complaining. Then, the deafening sound of cracks spreading through the main columns. The laughter stopped. Samson clenched his teeth, gathering every ounce of strength he still had. And with one final effort, he pushed with all his soul. The entire temple shook. The Philistines screamed, their faces contorted with pure terror. The columns began to break, and in one single instant, everything collapsed. The roof cracked, tons of stone fell, crushing princes, soldiers, and everyone who was there. In that moment, the roar of destruction was heard throughout the city. The largest Philistine temple, a symbol of oppression against Israel, was reduced to rubble. And Samson, the man who failed but rose again through faith, died along with his enemies, achieving his greatest victory. His body was found among the debris, and his people, upon retrieving his remains, knew that this man, despite all his failures, had fulfilled his purpose. He freed Israel in a way no one ever expected. Samson died as a hero. Not because he was perfect, but because, in the end, he recognized that his strength had always come from God. His final act of faith and courage destroyed an empire, proving that even when we fall, we can still rise and fulfill what we were called to do. And so, his story echoes to this day. Not just as a tale of physical strength, but as a powerful reminder, the greatest victory is not in never falling, but in trusting in God to rise one last time. Samson was always a strong man. From his mother's womb, he was set apart by God for a great mission. He was a Nazirite, chosen to deliver Israel from the rule of the Philistines. His strength was legendary. He killed a lion with his bare hands, defeated entire armies, and tore down the gates of a city. But in the end, his greatest battle was not against the Philistines, it was against himself. For a long time, Samson believed that his strength was enough. He became arrogant, impulsive, and often ignored God's warnings. He played with danger, trusting more in his own abilities than in the purpose he was given. He surrounded himself with people who did not share his faith, leading him to make wrong decisions. His downfall did not begin when he was captured, but long before, when he started to despise what God had given him. When Samson was betrayed by Delilah and handed over to the Philistines, he lost more than his sight, he lost control of his own life. Now, chained, humiliated, and mocked, he finally had a moment of clarity. For the first time, he understood something he had never realized before: true strength was not in his muscles but in his dependence on God. It was there, in the depths of his pain and shame, that Samson prayed the most sincere prayer of his life. He did not ask for revenge, he did not ask to escape, he asked God to strengthen him one last time. Not out of pride, not for himself, but to fulfill his final mission. At that moment, Samson was no longer the impulsive man who thought he was invincible. He was a broken man, fully aware that his strength had always come from God and that without him, he was nothing. And that is what his story teaches us. How many times do we rely on our own strength, our own intelligence, believing that we can handle everything on our own? How many times do we ignore God's warnings, thinking we know what is best for us? Samson learned the hard way that strength without character, without humility, and without faith is a trap. But there is something powerful in this story. Samson fell, but God still used him. His failure was not the end. In his final act, he fulfilled his purpose and brought down the pillars of the Philistine temple, securing victory for Israel. This shows us that even when we fail, God can still restore us and use us for something great. True strength is not found in muscles, money, influence, or power. True strength comes from humility, obedience, and total dependence on God. Without this, even the strongest will fall. But with it, even the weakest can rise and accomplish the impossible. What makes Samson's story so impactful is not just his downfall, but his redemption. In his final moments, blind, chained, and ridiculed by his enemies, he found something he may have never fully experienced before: true dependence on God. In that great Philistine hall, as the people laughed and mocked him, he made his last prayer. But this time, it was not a request driven by pride or a desire for revenge. It was a sincere cry from a broken heart: "Lord, remember me. Strengthen me just once more." These words carried pain, regret, and above all, faith. And God heard him. Strength returned to his body, and in one final act of courage and surrender, Samson brought down the pillars of the temple, destroying his enemies along with it. The one who had been an object of scorn became, in the end, an instrument of divine judgment. His death brought more victory to Israel than all the battles he had fought in life. But what does this story really teach us? Samson is remembered not just for his strength but for his internal struggle between his weaknesses and God's calling. And that is the reality for all of us. We all have battles, we all make mistakes, we have all strayed at some point. But the great lesson here is that as long as there is life, there is time to return to God. You may have failed. You may have felt weak, betrayed, or lost. But Samson's story proves that the end of the road for man is never the end of the road for God. What matters is not how many times we fall, but whether, in the end, we choose to turn back to the one who can restore us. Samson was a warrior, not because he never fell, but because even in his lowest moment, he cried out to God until the very end. And now, I ask you, what is your calling? Do you still have the strength to rise and fulfill the purpose God has for you? The answer may be closer than you think.